Thomas lived alone on a stretch of dry land at the edge of Arizona in the late 1800s. His small ranch was simple, made up of a one-room cabin, a barn, and a few cattle that he cared for with great effort. Every morning he woke up before the sun rose, made himself a pot of coffee over the fire, and walked out to the fields where the land stretched as far as the eye could see. The desert was quiet except for the sound of the wind blowing through the brush and the occasional cry of a hawk circling above. Life was not easy for Thomas. He had once been married when he was younger, but his wife had passed away many years earlier, leaving him alone. Since then, the years rolled by with nothing but work to fill his days. He mended fences, planted what little crops could grow in the dry soil, and tended to his animals. At night he sat on his porch with only the stars for company. The loneliness weighed on him, though he rarely admitted it out loud. People in town often spoke of him as that farmer with no family, but he was used to such talk. Despite being alone, Thomas was not a bitter man. He was quiet, gentle, and carried a strong sense of fairness in his heart. When he rode into town once a week for supplies, he greeted the store owner with a nod and sometimes stayed long enough for a short conversation. But he never lingered. The town was full of families and groups of friends who shared laughter and stories, and Thomas often felt like an outsider among them. He would load up his wagon, tip his hat politely, and return to his lonely ranch. One hot afternoon, after weeks of hard work under the burning sun, Thomas decided to go into town. He needed flour, beans, and nails to fix a broken section of his barn roof. As he tied his horse outside the general store, he noticed something unusual. A crowd had gathered near the center of town, where the auction platform was set up. It was not the usual sale of cattle or tools. The voices in the crowd sounded sharper, full of curiosity and judgment. Thomas walked closer, his boots raising small clouds of dust with each step. What he saw made his heart heavy. On the platform stood a woman, her hands bound with rope. She was Apache, her dark eyes proud and steady despite the situation. Her long black hair fell over her shoulders, and though her dress was worn and torn, she stood upright as if refusing to bow to shame. The auctioneer shouted loudly, telling the townspeople that she was the last Apache left behind in the territory, as though she was some object to be traded rather than a human being. The people in the crowd whispered to each other. Some looked at her with curiosity, others with hostility. A few laughed cruelly, making comments that revealed no kindness. Thomas watched in silence. He had seen the way settlers treated native people before, but something about this moment struck him differently. The woman looked so alone yet so strong. She did not lower her head or cry. Instead, she faced the crowd with dignity, even when no one offered her compassion. The auctioneer tried to start the bidding, but no one stepped forward. People were there to watch, not to help. Some muttered that she was trouble and too dangerous. Others said she was useless, with no family or tribe left to protect her. Thomas could hear their words, and each one made his chest feel heavier. He thought of his own life back on the ranch. Day after day of silence, meals eaten alone, no one to share the burden of hard work, no one to talk to when the nights grew long. And here, right in front of him, was a woman who, like him, had been left alone by life in a world that was unkind. Before he could stop himself, Thomas did something that shocked everyone. He raised his hand and said, "I'll take her." The crowd turned to stare. The auctioneer paused, then smirked as if amused by the idea. "The farmer wants her?" he said loudly. Laughter spread through the crowd. Some shook their heads, whispering that Thomas had lost his mind. Others muttered that he was foolish. But Thomas did not care what they thought. He stepped forward and placed his money on the platform, the few dollars he had saved from selling cattle. It was not a grand fortune, but it was enough. The auctioneer shrugged, untied the woman's hands, and announced that she now belonged to Thomas. The word stung him because he did not see her as property. He had not stepped forward to own her, but to free her from the cruel gaze of the town. As the crowd dispersed, Thomas walked toward her. He could see the mistrust in her eyes, sharp and unyielding. She did not thank him or smile. She simply stood, uncertain of what his intentions were. Thomas spoke softly, careful not to startle her. "You're free now. You can come with me if you choose. I've got food and shelter, and I won't harm you." She said nothing. He realized she might not understand his words. But after a long moment, she followed him toward his wagon. Her steps were slow, cautious, but she did not turn away. Thomas helped her climb in, though she refused his hand. Together they rode out of town, leaving behind the whispers and stares of those who could not understand. On the journey back to his ranch, Thomas thought about what had just happened. He knew the town would talk. They would say he was strange, reckless, even dangerous. But for the first time in years, he did not care about their judgment. He looked at the woman sitting silently in his wagon, her eyes fixed on the horizon, and felt something stir inside him. Not excitement or joy, but the quiet sense that his lonely life had shifted in a way he could not yet explain. When they reached the ranch, Thomas showed her the small cabin, the barn, and the open land. He pointed to the well where she could draw water and the kitchen where food was stored. She listened, though she did not speak. That night, Thomas gave her his bed while he slept on a blanket near the fireplace. He wanted her to know she was safe. As he closed his eyes, Thomas realized his life would no longer be the same. He had lived alone for so many years, and now there was another soul on his land. He did not know if she would trust him, if she would stay, or if she would leave as soon as she had the chance. All he knew was that he could not stand by and watch her be humiliated in town. He had acted from his heart, and time would reveal the path ahead. For the first time in a long while, Thomas did not feel entirely alone. The morning after Thomas brought the Apache woman to his ranch, the sun rose bright and sharp over the desert hills. He woke early, as he always did, and stepped outside to the smell of dry earth and sagebrush. For a moment, he almost forgot there was someone else inside his cabin. He was so used to the silence of living alone that the thought of another person sleeping under his roof felt strange and new. When he walked back inside, she was awake. She sat on the edge of the bed, her back straight, her eyes fixed on him with suspicion. She had not touched the food he left out the night before, a piece of bread and some beans. Thomas realized she still did not trust him, and maybe she never would. He gave her a small nod, then went about his morning as usual, starting a fire, boiling coffee, and feeding the animals. He did not force her to join him or try to speak too much. He knew that kindness was not shown in words alone, but in action. He made sure she had water to wash her face, and he set out more food for her in case she felt safe enough to eat. Later that morning, Thomas hitched his horse to the wagon. He had to go into town again, not for supplies, but because he knew the people would be whispering already. He did not want the woman, whose name he still did not know, to hear the cruel words of others if she was with him. So he went alone. When he arrived, the town was alive with gossip. Men at the saloon laughed and nudged each other when they saw him. Women at the general store shook their heads, whispering behind their hands. One man spat on the ground near Thomas's boots and muttered, "You've lost your mind, farmer." Bringing one of them to your place, Thomas ignored them. He bought flour, sugar, and salt quietly, paid with his coins, and left without answering a single insult. He had lived long enough to know that nothing he said would change their minds. But deep down he felt a spark of anger, not for himself but for the woman who had endured worse than words. When he returned to the ranch, he found her outside. She stood near the well, her hands cupping water to her mouth. She glanced at him but did not look away this time. For the first time he noticed something softer in her eyes, not trust but curiosity. Days turned into weeks. Slowly a rhythm began to form between them. Thomas worked the land as always, and she watched at first, silent and guarded. Then one day, without a word, she picked up a bucket and helped him carry water to the cattle. Another time she gathered wild herbs and left them by the fire, showing him with gestures how they could be used for cooking. Thomas realized she was not helpless, as the townspeople had claimed. She was strong, resourceful, and skilled in ways he could only admire. He wanted to thank her, but he struggled to find the right words. Instead, he tried to show respect by giving her space, never demanding anything and letting her choose her place in the ranch. Communication between them was difficult. Thomas spoke only English and she spoke Apache. Still, they found small ways to understand each other. He pointed to objects and said their names, and she sometimes repeated them, teaching him the Apache word in return. Slowly, a bridge formed between their worlds. One evening, as the fire crackled, Thomas pointed to himself and said, "Thomas." She hesitated, then touched her chest lightly and said, "Ayana." It was the first time he had heard her voice, and it felt like a gift. From that day on, he called her Ayana. Saying her name aloud gave life to their connection, but the outside world was not ready to accept it. Word spread quickly in town that the farmer and the Apache woman were living together. People began to judge him more harshly. Some neighbors who once nodded politely now turned their backs. A group of men even rode out to his ranch one afternoon, standing at the fence line with their arms crossed. "You're making a mistake, Thomas," one of them called out. "She doesn't belong here. Send her away before trouble comes." Thomas stood firm, his hands resting on the fence. "She stays," he answered simply. The men exchanged glances, muttered under their breath, and rode away. But Thomas knew they would not forget. That night, as the stars spread across the sky, Thomas sat on the porch, deep in thought. Ayanna joined him silently, carrying a small bundle of herbs. She placed them near him and mimed rubbing them on his arm where a blister had formed from long hours of work. He let her, and the cool touch of the plant soothed the burn. It was a small act, but to Thomas it meant more than words could say. As summer turned to autumn, the bond between them grew stronger. They worked side by side in the fields, repaired the barn roof together, and shared quiet meals by the fire. Sometimes they even laughed. Simple laughter when Thomas mispronounced an Apache word or when Ayanna tried to mimic his slow drawl of English. Yet beneath their growing trust, Thomas knew the world outside would always see them as different. The town might never accept Ayanna. They might never look at him without judgment. But when he looked at her, he no longer saw the last Apache woman or someone left behind. He saw a person who had endured hardship with dignity, someone who brought life back into his empty ranch. One evening, after a long day of mending fences, Thomas found himself speaking words he had never imagined he would say. "I was alone for too many years," he told her softly, even though he wasn't sure how much she understood. "Now I'm not." Ayanna didn't answer in words, but she sat down beside him on the porch. Together they watched the desert sunset paint the sky in gold and crimson. No one else was there to see it, and no one else needed to. From that moment on, Thomas knew his choice at the auction had not been a mistake. It had been the beginning of a story neither of them had expected, but both of them needed. The first signs of winter came early that year. The desert air turned sharp and cold at night, and Thomas worked harder than ever to make sure the ranch was ready. He repaired the roof so the rain wouldn't leak through, stacked wood high for the fire, and made sure the cattle had shelter from the wind. But this winter was different from all the others he had faced. For the first time in years, he wasn't preparing to spend it alone. Ayanna was part of his daily life now. What had started as silence between them had slowly turned into something else. They were learning to understand each other, not perfectly, but enough to share simple thoughts. Thomas had a strong patience, and Ayanna had a quiet determination. Every evening after work, they sat by the fire. Thomas pointed to objects and named them in English, and Ayanna repeated. Then she would point and say the word in Apache, and he would try to copy. Sometimes he made mistakes so badly that Ayanna would laugh, a soft, quick laugh that surprised him the first time he heard it. It warmed him more than the fire ever could. One evening, after many weeks, Ayanna brought out a small pouch she carried with her. Inside were dried plants, seeds, and bits of roots. She spread them carefully on the table and through gestures began teaching Thomas what each one meant. She showed him how certain leaves could soothe a sore throat, how a mixture of roots could bring down a fever, and how dried seeds could be boiled into a tea that gave strength. Thomas listened closely, amazed by her knowledge. She had lived through hardships he could never imagine, and yet she carried within her the wisdom of survival. The more time they spent together, the more Thomas noticed how much life had returned to his home. The cabin that had once been silent now carried small sounds, the clinking of dishes as Ayanna cooked, the low hum of her voice as she worked, and even the soft rhythm of her footsteps. Thomas, who had always eaten plain meals of beans and bread, found himself surprised when Ayanna began cooking in her own way. She gathered herbs from the land and used them to bring flavor to simple food. The first time he tasted a dish she made, he was caught off guard. "This is good," he said, tapping his spoon against the bowl. She smiled faintly, her eyes meeting his for just a moment before she looked away. Working together changed everything on the ranch. Ayanna was strong, more than Thomas expected. She carried water, mended clothes, and even guided cattle with surprising ease. But what amazed him most was her knowledge of the land itself. When a drought threatened the crops, Thomas worried the soil was too dry for anything to grow. Ayanna walked the fields quietly, touching the earth with her hands, and then led Thomas to a spot he had never thought to plant before. She showed him how the soil there held more moisture. They planted together, and weeks later small shoots of green pushed up, giving hope that the harvest might not fail after all. At first, Thomas didn't know how to thank her. He wasn't a man of many words. But he found small ways to show it. He built her a small wooden box for her herbs, carefully smoothing the edges so she could keep her medicine safe. He also carved a simple stool so she wouldn't have to sit on the floor near the fire. When he gave these things to her, she touched them gently, then gave a small nod. It wasn't much, but Thomas could tell she understood. But while their life together grew stronger, the outside world continued to press against them. The town's judgment never faded. Each time Thomas went for supplies, the whispers grew louder. Some accused him of being foolish, others of being dangerous. Ayanna never went with him. Thomas knew it would only bring her more pain. Still, he made sure to protect the life they were building on the ranch, even if it meant standing alone against the town. One late afternoon, Thomas came back from town carrying a sack of flour. As he walked into the cabin, he saw Ayanna crouch near the fire, showing him something she had carved out of wood, a small figure of a bird. She handed it to him carefully. He turned it over in his hands, surprised at the detail. The wings were smooth, the beak sharp, and the bird looked as if it might take flight. He looked up at her, and for the first time, she met his eyes fully. In that silent exchange, he felt something shift. That night, as the fire flickered low, Thomas thought about how much had changed. Only months earlier, he had lived a life of endless silence. Now, he was learning words in a new language, sharing meals made with herbs he had never tasted, and finding joy in simple carvings left by the fire. It was not just the ranch that had come alive, it was his spirit too. Still, challenges remained. Ayanna was cautious. Though she had begun to trust Thomas, he could see the shadow of her past in her eyes. She had lost her people, her family, her home. She carried that pain quietly, but it never left her. Sometimes Thomas caught her looking toward the horizon, as if searching for something that was no longer there. He never asked her about it. He knew some wounds were too deep for words. One evening, as the cold winds rattled the windows, Thomas decided to tell her something about himself. He spoke slowly, not sure how much she would understand. "I had a wife once," he said, staring into the fire. "She passed away a long time ago. Since then, it's just been me." He didn't expect a reply, but after a pause, Ayanna placed her hand gently on the table between them. She didn't speak, but the gesture was enough. For the first time in years, Thomas felt as though someone understood his loneliness. Their bond was still fragile, like a seedling pushing through the dry soil, but it was growing. Together they were shaping a life that neither had expected. The farmer who had once lived alone now had someone by his side, and the woman who had been left behind now had a place where she was valued. As the days grew colder, Thomas and Ayanna prepared for the harshest months of winter. But this time, when the winds howled and the nights stretched long, they were not two souls alone in the world. They were together, learning, sharing, and slowly weaving a life that gave them both strength. And though they could not yet say it out loud, both knew the truth. They were no longer strangers, but partners in survival, bound not by chains or circumstance, but by choice and quiet trust. The new year brought with it challenges that neither Thomas nor Ayanna could have expected. The winter had been cold, but they had managed to get through it together with firewood, simple meals, and shared work. When spring came, Thomas felt hopeful. The crops he had planted were beginning to grow, and the cattle were healthy. For the first time in many years, he felt as though life might finally be turning in his favor. But trouble often came when it was least wanted. The people in town had not forgotten about him or Ayanna. Every time he went for supplies, Thomas could feel their eyes on him. The whispers followed him from the general store to the blacksmith shop. "There goes the farmer with the Apache woman." Some spat on the ground as he walked by. Others shook their heads as though he had committed some crime. One afternoon, while Thomas was fixing a fence near the road, 3 men rode up on horseback. They were neighbors from the outer edges of town, men he had known for years but never been close to. They stopped near his fence, dust rising from their horses' hooves. "You're making a mistake, Thomas," one of them called out. His voice was sharp, carrying the weight of warning. "She doesn't belong here. People are talking. Folks don't like what you've done." Thomas leaned against the fence post, steady and calm. "She's not hurting anyone. She's working, same as me. That's all there is to it." The men exchanged looks. Another one shook his head. "You're blind, farmer. You keep her here and trouble will come. Mark my words." With that, they turned their horses and rode away, leaving Thomas standing in the dust. He knew the men's words weren't just empty threats. They were a warning that the town would never fully accept Ayanna. That evening, when he returned to the cabin, Ayanna noticed the tightness in his face. She didn't ask, but Thomas could tell she sensed something was wrong. She offered him food and placed her carved bird on the table, as if to remind him that even in dark times there was beauty worth holding on to. The days grew warmer, and soon summer's heat pressed down on the land. That year the rain barely came. The soil cracked and the riverbeds dried. Thomas watched his crops wither under the sun, and worry gnawed at him. Without food, they wouldn't last the season, but Ayanna had lived through such hardships before. One morning, she took Thomas by the hand and led him away from the fields. They walked for hours across the land until they came to a narrow canyon. At the base of the rocks, she knelt and began digging with her hands. To Thomas's surprise, damp earth appeared beneath the surface. Soon, water trickled out, a hidden spring he had never known was there. She looked up at him, her face calm, as if to say, "The land still provides if you know where to look." With her guidance, Thomas carried water back to the fields. It was hard work, but slowly the plants began to recover. Without Ayanna's knowledge, the farm might not have survived at all. Despite their struggles, the bond between them grew stronger. Thomas admired her courage, her wisdom, and her quiet strength. He noticed how she always carried herself with dignity, even when others judged her unfairly. She had lost everything, yet she still found ways to give, to teach, and to endure. But the town did not see her as he did. One day, while Thomas was in town buying seed, 2 women standing near the store spoke loud enough for him to hear. "That farmer's lost his senses," one said, "bringing an Apache into his home. Shameful." The other replied, "Mark my words, it will end badly." Thomas clenched his jaw but said nothing. He had learned that words would not change their hearts. Still, the weight of their judgment followed him home. That evening he told Ayanna what had been said. He spoke slowly, unsure how much she understood, but she listened quietly. When he finished, she placed her hand on his arm and gave him a steady look. "Together," she said softly, one of the few English words she had learned clearly. It was enough. Their greatest test came in late summer. The drought worsened, and one by one the neighboring farms began to fail. Men who had once mocked Thomas now struggled to keep their families fed. Some left the land entirely, heading east in search of better fortune. Others grew bitter. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, a group of men came to the ranch. They stopped at the gate, their faces shadowed and hard. "You're taking water that don't belong to you," one of them accused. "Word is you found a spring and you're keeping it to yourself." Thomas stepped forward. "That spring's on my land. I've got every right to use it. And if you'd asked instead of threatening, I'd have shared," the men muttered angrily. But before they could reply, Ayanna appeared from behind the barn, carrying a bucket of water. Her presence silenced them. Some of the men looked away, uneasy. Others glared, their resentment sharp. "See?" one spat. "She's the reason. You trust her, and now she's leading you down the wrong path." Thomas's voice was calm but firm. "No, she saved this farm. Without her, there'd be nothing here for anyone." The men shifted uncomfortably, then turned and left. But Thomas knew the tension would not vanish overnight. That night, as they sat by the fire, Thomas felt a deep weariness. Yet when he looked at Ayanna, he also felt something stronger than fear. He realized that what they had built together was worth any struggle. The world outside might never understand, but within the walls of their small cabin there was trust, respect, and even the beginnings of love. Slowly, as the seasons passed, some of the neighbors began to see Ayanna differently. When a child fell sick, Thomas and Ayanna shared her herbal remedies. When another family's well ran dry, Thomas led them to the hidden spring. Bit by bit, the whispers of anger turned into murmurs of respect. Not everyone changed, but some began to see the truth. Ayanna was not a burden but a blessing. By the time autumn came, Thomas realized something important. His life had been marked by loneliness and silence, but now every day was filled with purpose. He was no longer just a farmer working a dry land. He was part of something larger, a partnership built on survival, respect, and quiet defiance against a world that wanted them apart. As the leaves turned gold and the nights grew longer, Thomas and Ayanna sat together on the porch. They watched the horizon, where the sky met the desert in endless shades of red, and though the world around them might still judge, neither of them felt alone anymore. Years passed on the quiet stretch of land where Thomas and Ayanna had built their life together. The ranch, once lonely and silent, now carried the sounds of two people who worked side by side, shared meals, and faced every challenge together. The seasons continued to turn, the burning summers, the dry winds, the short winters, but no matter what came, they endured. Their story, whispered at first with judgment in the town, slowly turned into something else. A tale people could not ignore. At first, Thomas never thought much about what others said. He had always been a man who lived apart from gossip. But over time, he began to notice something changing. Where once there had been only scorn and suspicion, there was now a cautious kind of respect. It started small. A family who had once turned their backs came to the ranch after their child fell sick. They had heard of Ayanna's knowledge of herbs. Though they looked uneasy, they asked for her help. Ayanna gave them medicine made from her dried roots and leaves. The child recovered within days. Word spread quickly. Soon others came quietly, some with fevers, some with wounds that would not heal. Ayanna treated them all without asking for payment, only offering what she knew from her people. Many of those who had judged her began to see her differently. They still did not always speak kindly, but their eyes no longer carried the same harshness. Some even greeted Thomas in town with a nod, though the memory of old prejudice never fully disappeared. For Thomas, the change mattered less than the peace he found at home. He had once thought of himself as just a farmer struggling against the land, but now his days were filled with a greater purpose. Ayanna taught him things he had never known, how to listen to the earth, how to respect the smallest plants that grew in the harshest soil, and how to see beauty even in hardship. He in return taught her to read a few English words, to mend fences with wire, and to care for the cattle. They had become a team, bound not by chance but by choice. Still, the past was never far from Ayanna's eyes. Sometimes Thomas would find her standing at the edge of the land, staring toward the mountains. He knew she was thinking of her people, the family she had lost, the tribe that had been scattered. She never spoke of it much, but her silence carried weight. Thomas never tried to erase her pain. Instead, he offered quiet presence, letting her know she was not alone anymore. One autumn evening, as the sky blazed with red and gold, Thomas sat on the porch with her. He spoke slowly, searching for the right words. "When I bought you that day," he said, his voice heavy with memory, "I didn't do it to own you. I just couldn't stand the thought of you left to their cruelty." Ayanna looked at him, her eyes steady. "I know," she said in her soft English. It was only 2 words, but they carried the weight of understanding. The ranch grew slowly over the years. With Ayanna's help, Thomas was able to keep the crops alive even in harsh seasons. They raised more cattle, and the land became richer than it had ever been. Children from neighboring farms began to visit, eager to learn from Ayanna about the plants she used, the stories she told, and the ways she respected the land. She never boasted or demanded attention, but her presence quietly shaped the world around her. By the time Thomas's hair had turned gray and lines had deepened across his face, the once lonely ranch had become a place of quiet reputation. Travelers passing through often stopped, curious about the farmer and the Apache woman who lived together. Some came with doubt, but most left with respect after seeing the peace and dignity that filled their home. The story of their lives began to spread, told in hushed voices at campfires and trading posts. People called them the farmer and the last Apache woman. To some, it was a curiosity. To others, it was a symbol, a reminder that even in a world full of division and judgment, 2 people could build something stronger through kindness and resilience. Thomas and Ayanna never set out to become legends. They lived simply, waking with the sun, working the land, and ending each day by the fire. But their life together carried lessons that others could not ignore. They showed that dignity could survive even in hardship, that respect could grow between the most unlikely of people, and that love could bloom in silence where words often failed. One evening, long after many of the neighbors who had once scorned them had either moved away or passed on, Thomas sat with Ayanna under the stars. The desert was quiet except for the soft chirp of crickets. He looked at her, her hair now streaked with gray, her face lined by years but still strong. "We've done well, haven't we?" he said softly. Ayanna turned to him, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "Together," she replied, the same word she had once spoken long ago when they faced judgment and fear. It was still the truest word between them. Their life was not easy. It had been filled with struggle, droughts, harsh winters, and the heavy weight of society's disapproval. But in the end, none of that defined them. What defined them was the simple truth that two people, once strangers, had chosen to face the world side by side. In time, the legend of Thomas and Ayanna outlived them both. Travelers spoke of the farmer who had bought a woman at an auction, not to own her but to save her, and how the two of them built a home filled with dignity. Children remembered the lessons Ayanna had taught them, and families passed down the story as an example of courage, kindness, and quiet love. The Wild West was full of tales, some of violence, some of conquest, some of greed. But among those stories, one stood apart: the story of a farmer who lived alone for years, and the Apache woman who taught him that even in the harshest land, life could bloom again. And so, in the endless desert where the sky stretched wide and the earth carried both pain and promise, their story lived on, not as a tale of loneliness or loss, but as a reminder of what it means to find family, respect, and love in the most unexpected place.